Broadcasting from the far side of Enceladus, beaming in at the speed of light across the vast chasms of space, streaming directly into your brain, you're listening to episode 35 of the Spartacast League. Joining us today are your hosts, Jazzy Vidalia, that's myself, and Dark Moonpaw. Hey there, Dark.
Hello, how are you folks? I am surviving, as always, and you should be at home,
Hmm,
just so you know.
Definitely make sure that you're at home. It is super important to make sure that you are socially isolated, socially distanced, whatever the word is you want to use. But to begin the show, I want to read an excerpt from the Communist Manifesto, one that I think succinctly sums up the events of this month and this year so far. And that is the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them, the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered forms was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguished the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into the air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations to his own kind. Now, how about that? Quite an apt summary for this year, isn't it, A Dark?
It's quite a apt one, I'd suggest, yeah, because the main theme of that simple paragraph in the manifesto is, it's about withering away from a norm, at least the vibes that most people get from it. And what we're seeing, I guess, throughout the past few weeks, and it has been a hectic few weeks, it's been quite eventful. What we've been seeing is we have been seeing a rupture in the system, a rupture that we knew was coming, but the fact that a simple pandemic acted as the catalyst for that rupture, it's quite telling that the system's fragility is essentially showing itself even more than what it perhaps did before. I mean, even more so, I'd argue, than 2008, which was the last time we saw a major collapse in the economic order of things. So, I definitely think, yes, it does summate quite well the whole theme of today's show, which is, a lot of it's about the withering away of that normality and how people will react to the withering away of that normality, which we'll be discussing in terms of panic buying, racism, and the rampant ageism. In fact, we've gotten from politicians, which I'm sure you'd agree. There's been a lot of that as of late.
And not just the withering away, but also the exposing of capitalism for what it is and also for what a lot of people didn't realize that it was. For instance, that we are starting to see modern day neoliberal capitalism expose itself not only as a vector of greed, but also in many facets, it's also become somewhat of a death cult, if you will, as well. Because now we have both politicians and political pundits on mainstream news going on national television telling people that we need to stop the social isolation, stop the social distancing, and get back into a normal mode of production because it's hurting our economy. And this is only after 2 or 3 weeks of quarantine in this country that we're seeing this. And on top of that, right when the quarantine was announced, right when the problem was actually realized towards the beginning of March, we saw the markets immediately and viscerally react by just dumping stocks, by selling it. We saw a third of the value of the stock market just evaporate into seemingly nothing, but really what it is, it's the concentration of wealth. People are still profiting from it because they're selling their stock and thus getting money for what they sold it for. So don't take this as people just losing money. This is a consolidation. But what we're also seeing are these pundits like the lieutenant governor of Texas going on air to Tucker Carlson and saying old people should sacrifice themselves for the economy.
It's unsurprising because they don't view the elderly, especially those in permanent care, perhaps, as valuable. Because if they can't contribute to an economy, as they would say, then why bother helping them? We didn't just see that with Republican politicians in the States, we also saw that within the UK by the Conservative Party. In fact, to start off with, it's a known fact that there is a there's a correlation between coronavirus fatalities and people above the age of 80. The fatality rate for people above the age of 80 is 14.8%. This has been associated very much with the fact that a lot of conservative politicians have been parroting the notion of what you call herd immunity. What herd immunity basically means, in simple terms, is it involves getting a large amount of people in a population, a large percentage of that population infected, and via either direct previous infections or vaccinations, getting a large proportion of them immune in turn, to develop this whole herd mentality. But the problem with this mentality is it doesn't work with people who have immunodeficiencies, which is most definitely a very large proportion of elderly people and people with other various difficulties, like with their liver. A lot of alcoholics have problems with their liver, for example, and that they can't, their immune system is severely compromised because of that. And then that they carry that on throughout their life, even if they recover from associated conditions like that. But the point of the matter is, the Prime Minister of the UK essentially suggested this as an idea, and the Conservative Party got behind it, while failing to realize the common sense fact that, one, you can't get immunity if the patient dies, and two, it's only ever talked about in the context of vaccines. You don't just rely on a population to get immunity. That's not how it works. You don't just go out and shake everybody's hand and get everybody sick. Making that kind of assertion is medically inaccurate and extremely stupid. But the truth is, what that showcased in the UK at the very least, and in the US perhaps, that it's quite clear that the majority of these politicians, they would prefer to maintain their legacies, which has often been, the majority of conservative politicians care about one thing, it's the GDP of the country. If something jeopardizes that fantasy of maintaining that GDP to have some sort of quote unquote economic legacy, what we're seeing then is a way of trying to maintain that, to essentially sacrifice large proportions of vulnerable working class people rather than actually providing concrete measures to protect their own population.
What I actually noticed about the talking point about herd immunity is not only was it wrong, Trump also tried to pull a similar line to Boris Johnson. I believe actually before Boris Johnson even said this. And I've been seeing on and off on the internet, especially among right wing circles, people spreading things like an article by the Federalist Society stating that, oh, you know what we should do is we should just have chickenpox parties for the coronavirus and just purposely go out and get infected. Which is funny because right after they posted that article and tweeted about it on Twitter, Twitter shut that down on their website, knowing exactly what kind of damage that this can do to society. And given the situation here, that kind of line is very, very dangerous because it is actively encouraging people not only to go out and get sick and endanger themselves, but also spread the disease to other people who they might not realize that they are spreading it to.
No, absolutely. And that has definitely been the case, because what we're seeing here is, in my eyes, it's another mass disinformation campaign by the entire right for different various reasons. Conservatives, for one, would rather do this to try and maintain some perceived form of status quo in the middle of this economic rupture, and obviously to defend the legacies of their chosen candidates, while fascists, on the other hand, see this as an opportunity to quote unquote cleanse the environment. A lot of eco fascists, for example, have been making the assertion that because humans haven't been around anymore, the planet is quote unquote healing. So it's not really capitalism that's the virus, it's just people, which is dumb. Even by a biological standpoint, it's just dumb. Doesn't even make sense. What we're seeing in that regard is, because the disinformation has been so bad and it's been absolutely abysmal on social media, especially on Facebook. What we're seeing is because people don't have this clear sense of direction, even if they do look at government sources, because there's so much conflicting information, what people have resorted in, they've either resorted in, three things. They've resorted in either racism, anti-Chinese racism, which has been very prevalent throughout the past few weeks. It's been very bad, actually. They've been blaming, I mean, governments around the world have also been adding to this. They've been blaming China for a lot of what's been happening without any deliberate proof. They've tried to target Chinese culture and ethnicity without any theoretical backing or evidence to suggest that the virus even started as a result of certain practices. And not a lot of people have been doing a lot about that. I mean, even social media websites have been, in my opinion, quite complicit in that. They've been allowing people to, I mean, there's a whole hashtag on Twitter about it being the quote unquote Chinese virus, which is what Donald Trump, funnily enough, said in public until apologizing, obviously, because he got into shit for that because it was one of the dumbest things you could ever say. And we're seeing a lot of that. People are pointing the finger at the Communist Party of China, even though the majority of doctors who are actually working to combat the disease, even if they have disagreements with China's policies, are, well, members of the Communist Party of China. And then, on top of that, people are panic buying. The phenomena when people buy unusually large amounts of a certain product, which is usually an essential item, in anticipation for a perceived disaster. People make mistakes a lot here as well because they seem to think that it's the same as disaster preparation. This is complete nonsense because disaster preparation is a long-term thing. Panic buying is an impulsive thing. It's not done in the long term, it's done in the short term. And the reason people do it in the short term is to, psychologically speaking, feel in control under their own individualistic culture.
But I also think that a large part of the panic buying is kind of also a response to a lot of people living paycheck to paycheck as well. They don't necessarily get the opportunity to do disaster preparedness because proper disaster preparedness assumes that you have the ability to continually buy things to stock your pantry or whatever. And so a lot of people don't necessarily have that luxury. But also, it is individualism that's at fault as well, because disaster preparedness, good disaster preparedness, really involves the community as a whole and not just one person. It's not just you stocking up that pantry for, a month at a time. It is you working with your community. And the reason that is because you can have all the materials in the world. You can have all the toilet paper stocked up. You can have all your buckets of emergency food that you bought from Alex Jones. You can have a ton of guns, somewhere in your closet. But that's really not going to help you a month out, a month later into the disaster. When you actually have to work with the community or everybody knows what you got and knows that you're hostile.
Oh, no, no, I can see where you're coming from there. And this is the thing, this is why panic buying correlates with a 800% increase, according to Business Insider, I believe, for the past few weeks in hand sanitizer sales. People don't panic buy to necessarily be rational. That's not the point of it. The whole point of it is to feel at control, to override the driving force of this whole ordeal, which is uncertainty. And this has only been exaggerated by the array of disinformation that conservative politicians and the majority of the right have been adding to. So, and that's why a lot of healthcare professionals have had to be more specific. They've had to be more clear about the aspects of this disease, where it came from, what adds to it, what are the risk factors, all that, all simple stuff. But the problem is, because I mean, there's people out there who don't even think it exists. That's how bad that's how bad the disinformation's gone. There's people who don't think it's even real, which is testament again how rampant the misinformation campaign is. But there's a whole reason for that, and the driving force for that entire disinformation campaign is quite simple. It's to try and maintain the perceived identity of the status quo, to put people into a panic, to get them to blame each other rather than to cooperate with one another and to realize the rationality behind the situation. It's to allow individualism to become the main driving force of a crisis rather than collectivism. And we're seeing the same stuff with healthcare workers. I mean, struggling as well. NHS workers in the UK right now have had to make protective masks out of snorkels, according to the Guardian, as a result of recent shortages.
Doctors have been threatened with being fired for speaking out of the working conditions within hospitals because they don't have proper PPE, which means that they, in turn, can get sick caring for people with the virus. And they are literally being punished for coming out and talking about this. even though their lives are at risk here, not only are their lives at risk, but also anybody that they come into contact with could be at risk. They could be spreading the virus at a shopping center, when they get off work and have to go to the grocery store and find something to eat. Because we all got to do that. And so by not providing these doctors with the proper protective gear, the government is complicit in spreading this disease, spreading this virus.
And the problem in the UK right now is because the years of Tory austerity, which a lot of people still don't seem to get, has been kicking the NHS so hard in the balls that it has been unable to recover properly from shortages. And the NHS was not even well equipped to deal with this crisis to begin with. It was poorly equipped. It's been terribly equipped compared to other countries. I mean, we have a worse death rate right now than Germany. But the whole reason Germany's doing better is because of testing. Here's the big thing: the government hasn't been testing staff very well. The biggest criticism of the government right now from healthcare professionals is its inability to test people. But it does fine when Boris Johnson gets the coronavirus and they just hand him a testing kit like it's no big fucking deal. You know what I mean? So, yes, I agree. I think the government has been complicit in allowing healthcare workers to get sick because it hasn't been doing a lot to prevent them from getting sick. And then this very same government in the UK has demanded that people get out there and volunteer for the NHS to help cope with the demand that's been put on doctors and nurses. And I think that's fair. In fact, I encourage people to get out and volunteer. I mean, in fact, I'm doing it right now. But at the same time, it's also laughable for the government to demand this from people when the whole reason the NHS is in this mess is because of them in the first place. And these are the same people who say that we should unify and fight the virus instead of worrying about petty squabbles, as they would call them. But there's nothing petty about pointing out the political causes of an epidemic that could have easily been controlled in a much better way. That's not being petty. That's called pointing out reality, which is something they don't want to do because responsibility involves looking at reality in turn.
They don't want to be held accountable either, because the fact of the matter is, if you look at the situation like in the United States, for instance, the virus in the United States arrived at the same time that the virus arrived in South Korea. And South Korea has mostly got their situation under control. They acted fast, they acted hard, and they took on the problem. Now, in the United States, we had our government kind of waver back and forth between, okay, we're going to do this, but then spend 2 weeks debating on what this is in response to the problem. So it took almost a month for them to even get the stimulus package out to make sure that people get a one-time, maybe two-time payment of $1,200 so that they don't have to worry about rent. But, $1,200 doesn't cover rent a lot of places in the United States.
Absolutely not.
It definitely doesn't cover a lot once you factor in bills and whatnot and cost of living. So we're still dealing with the fact that a lot of things are in flux right now. Up to a third of Americans right now, their jobs are in flux. They're saying 20, 30 million Americans plus are going to be laid off within the next month or two. So we're looking at a situation where the government has been unwilling to deal with the problem, whether that be equipment through the DPA, which the Defense Protection Act, which Trump activated and then decided he wasn't going to actually use as it's written, and instead just ask these companies really nicely and maybe throw them some money so that they'll provide ventilators. But that's not what the DPA does. And the DPA was written so that if the United States goes to war, we can take over and nationalize or place under federal control factories so that they can build parts or equipment for war purposes, for defense purposes. And while arguably I do believe that the DPA being put in place is actually a good thing in this instance, because they're in theory going to use it to create ventilators, what I disagree with is the fact that Trump is actually unwilling to use the law to its full extent and how it was intentionally made. And the reason he's refusing to do this is corporate profit. And he's putting corporate profits before lives, which is a theme that we see over and over again, whether it's pundits coming on television asking elderly people to sacrifice themselves for the economy, whether it's asking workers to sacrifice themselves for the economy, whatever it is, it's always sacrifice to the line so that it goes up.
Yeah. And, we're seeing the same thing with prison systems as well. In fact, in the UK right now, recently, two of Britain's leading prison charities have actually demanded that there should be an early release of prisoners within the country because of the coronavirus outbreak. Because right now in the UK, what we're seeing in our prisons is, well, overcrowding. It's been a huge overcrowding crisis for the past while now. And the fact is, prisons are going to be hives for infectious diseases. Think about it. People barely have any space for one. They're all crowded often into one room a lot of the time, especially in America, which is even worse, I'd argue. And the problem is, because of this, a lot of charities have demanded to the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, the pressure on prisoners should be eased during this crisis, because the problem is they are especially at risk in prison, and they have the very high possibility of dying from this, even if they are relatively healthy. But that's what we're seeing here. The trend I've seen, it's sacrifice, but the sacrifice is never, it's never just ordinary people. It's always the vulnerable. It's never anything else. It's not about always keeping people healthy. It's about sacrificing what you can to ensure the line stays up for a little bit, just to please the shareholders. If they're not printing money, that's what they're suggesting next. The whole reason Britain got so bad compared to the rest of Europe, barring Spain and Italy, which is another big complication, the whole reason it got very bad here compared to Germany and other European countries is because our prime minister wanted to treat it as business as usual, which is exactly what your country has been doing for the past while as well. And as we can see, you've beat the record. You lot have more infections than the rest of the whole fucking planet. And it's impressive, really, in a very bad way.
USA, USA, USA. I'm sorry.
Basically, that's the whole point. That's how a lot of eco-fascists have tried to see this situation, and that's what they've tried to do to spin the narrative. And what leftists need to realize is they also need to not fall into that, because what I've noticed with a lot of leftists as well, they fall into this trap of empty misanthropy. And what I mean by that is, they often accidentally agree with what certain eco-fascists suggest, not necessarily in terms of overpopulation, but in terms of people being the problem for the world and not socioeconomic forces, which is idealistic and not materialistic for one. But it also ignores biology, and ecology, and how organisms interact with environments. The whole point is to acknowledge the fact that people were never the problem; it was the system, and that's why the status quo has been trying to cling to that normality.
Also, I guess you could put it in terms of, do you dislike the people or do you dislike their opinions as well?
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you said earlier, though, about the prisons, because, of course, the United States, of course, has the largest prisoner population in the world per capita. And also, we have these ICE facilities, which are effectively just small concentration camps at this point, some of them not even small anymore. And with the virus going around, these places are going to turn into hotspots for spreading the virus. It's going to be really bad if someone gets infected in one of these situations, because these places are unsanitary. And also because we all know that medical care in these facilities is also not the greatest as well. So we're looking at a ticking time bomb. And when you talk about this kind of stuff, you also have to realize, when we talk about like the German death camps and whatnot during World War II, a lot of people forget, for instance, that Anne Frank didn't die in a gas chamber. She died of typhoid, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
What we are seeing here could be an unraveling of that system as well within our society. And on top of that, we also know that the government is getting ready for mass deaths, both in and outside the prison system, because prisoners at Rikers have actually been recruited for $6 an hour to dig mass graves for the city of New York at a public cemetery for people that can't afford to be buried anywhere else, which could be for the prisoners, but it's probably for the thousands of people that are dying that they can't find room to put the bodies in. So that's where they're going to put them. And that, by definition, is a mass grave, regardless if it's a lot of graves or one big trench.
No, absolutely. I can agree with that. But the thing is, again, it all goes back to that need to maintain the status quo. And what the left needs to understand here is it needs to be pointed out to people a lot more because the media is not going to talk about it. I mean, they haven't really at all. All the media is really talked about in Britain and in the US, from what I've noticed, is China. And all they've been doing is pointing the finger and saying China bad. And yeah, there's plenty of things you can criticize China for, in my opinion, but one of the things you can't fucking criticize them for is their ability to handle the infection. I mean, any Asian country for that matter at this rate, because they've been doing a lot bloody better than us. And that's the point. Because our governments didn't take an appropriate action to begin with, that's why we're in this bigger mess. And that's what a lot of people don't want to admit. So what the left needs to understand its role in this is not only does it have a moral duty to get out there and actually help the sick, to actually do what it can for the vulnerable where possible within your own means, but it also must understand that you're not going to stop misinformation simply by just pointing it out. You have to mock it, because if there's one thing these students dislike more, and I've noticed over the years, it's being mocked, because they know what they say deep down. They know what they say is absolute shit. You know, whether it's blaming China, whether it's saying that the coronavirus started from, I don't know, bat soup or something like that, which is the most dumb thing I've ever heard. But, you know, that's the kind of nonsense they say. And the funny thing is, they may think they believe it, but the truth of the matter has always been it's just absolute objective brain farts. You know, it has nothing to do with reality. If you allow that to happen without mockery, if you just allow it to stay the way it is without going out of your way to mock the very essence of that thought, where that thought stems from the pure idealism it stems from, you're only going to allow that misinformation to spread further. And that's when the panic buying will only get worse. That's when healthcare workers won't be able to get the stuff they need more, or the elderly or the sick. You know, this is where food banks have shortages. I mean, food banks have shortages in the UK right now because of panic buying. That's when you get people who go out of their way to buy toilet paper and then sell it for a fucking high price on eBay. You know, this is the whole point. The misinformation is designed to rake in profits. And the only way to stop those profits is to mock the sources of that misinformation, you know, to destroy one of its roots.
That's actually pretty typical with right-wing thought in general, and right-wing pundits, is they always have a big ego, and if you attack that ego, if you mock that ego, they just fucking lose it. That's always been a pattern. Now, one thing though that I did notice though, and this actually happened, I believe, yesterday, Fridays when I heard the news about it, is that even the governors, the state governors, are starting to go rogue on the administration here in the United States. I don't know if you saw this, but yesterday, in response to the federal government taking a stash of masks from Massachusetts, the Massachusetts government colluded with other state governments and also China to import masks, and they brought them in on a jumbo jet that was like branded with the Patriots football team gear all over it. It was quite amazing. And they just smuggled these masks into the United States. So we're actually getting to the point where we're actually starting to see not just the people angry at the administration, but we're also seeing state governments start taking things into their own hands because the government is just unwilling to respond to the disaster while these people are dying, in the streets. People are dying in hospitals. People are dying in their homes right now in New York. It's really, really bad.
But they still have time to impose sanctions on Iran, of course, because why worry about your own citizens when you can worry about starving another civilian population?
Right. And the federal government, in the meantime, is using sanctions against other countries as a weapon still, both in Iran. We're starting to see issues flare up with Venezuela again, where they accused Venezuela of some bizarre freaking conspiracy to import cocaine in the United States. It sounds like an inverse of Iran-Contra if you think about it. Like the very thing that Reagan was essentially accused of, they're trying to spin a counter narrative story to this and put Maduro at the center of it. It's fucking bizarre. There's no evidence that was actually even given to that situation as well. And it looks like it's just an excuse to attack their government, just like we're using sanctions right now to attack the government of Iran during a crisis instead of helping them, which is only going to get more people killed. It's not going to save lives. It's not going to inspire people to topple their government. The only thing it's going to do is inspire people to hate America, to hate Americans, and to want to retaliate against Americans. This kind of policy creates the very terrorist groups that America claims that they want the fight against, that they want to prevent.
Oh, it does. Like, it creates an almost a ripple effect, almost. And but this is the thing, it doesn't care that much about its terrorism problem, because if it did care about its terrorism problem, it would have done something about it before. But it doesn't. That's the point. It wants an excuse to make a profit out of the entire situation. Once again, and that has been demonstrated time and time again. But if it's not targeting other countries, and if it's not targeting healthcare workers, if it's not targeting, people who are opposing the lack of measures, if you will, from the government to do much about the crisis, it's spreading misinformation, as I've said plenty of times now. Even when the same countries you're spreading misinformation about are providing you assistance anyway, as if despite you. And that's what I find funny, because China is still giving the United States aid, even while Trump is accusing them of creating a bioweapon. I think that's the next big thing they've tried to say. But I think that's been flip flopping between the two ends, truth be told. So it's been a war of conspiracy almost. And that's the problem. That's why healthcare professionals need to be allowed into the media outlets more. But the media doesn't want that, because they want to create a sensationalism. People are probably wondering, well, what have people been doing to actually cope with this? Well, as I said, in the UK, the first thing people have been doing is volunteering for the NHS, which I encourage. You can find out more about this. You can just look it up. It's very easy to find out. There's been recent encouragements from the government and elsewhere to volunteer for the NHS, which I highly encourage, to help take off the pressure from nurses and doctors, and to help out where possible. But in America, there's also been a big initiative. Not just America. That's not true. For the world, actually, in many places, even in Ireland, in fact, right now, we're seeing the so-called rest strike come into effect, which has been occurring since the 1st of April.
There's more to it than just a rent strike, though. The rent strike is just one part of it. But what we're actually seeing is that this is a cumulative movement of various strikes that have been happening since the pandemic was starting to blossom back in March. We actually started seeing people just strike at their workplaces. And this is unheard of in the United States for a wildcat strike to just happen at a McDonald's or to happen at a Whole Foods or any other grocery store. Also, there was a major wildcat strike in Detroit with auto workers as well. So what we're seeing here is we're actually seeing the workers retaliate. We're seeing workers actually do something, which is extremely rare. What we're seeing there is we're seeing all these wildcat strikes occur, but we're not seeing them in the news, that they are being covered up, not reported on, just like the rent strike really hasn't gotten a lot of news either. I may have seen a couple articles in the Times and the Washington Post, but nothing significant.
Oh no, and I agree. I've actually been seeing that a lot recently as well. There has been quite a few strikes. In fact, McDonald's workers have been out in strike quite a bit now recently, in fact, because McDonald's, a multi-billion-dollar company, as we've all seen, has been refusing to actually give over 500,000 of its workers in the United States paid sick leave, I believe.
Right. That's actually something that a lot of companies in the United States just don't provide. It's very rare that, especially with minimum wage jobs or jobs that are pretty close to that, retail, food industry, those kind of jobs, service jobs, typically do not have paid sick leave. That if you get sick, you're kind of on your own. You kind of pay for it yourself. And if you're sick long enough, they will reprimand you. That's just life in the United States, and it sucks, to be honest. And it goes to show that our system wasn't built around the idea that something like this could ever happen. That in a way, we kind of assumed that this was an impossibility, that things like neoliberalism will always be as it is kind of thing, which is kind of a kind of an assumption within neoliberalism that these kind of things just generally don't seem to happen, I guess. And so society is very unprepared for when it does happen. We see that with paying people paycheck to paycheck, and we now understand why that is a problem, because people can't save. And if they don't have savings, they don't necessarily have the ability to store food, for instance, even short term, much less save up 3, 4, 5, 6 months of rent as well. That's asking a lot of most workers. And we're also seeing that, funny enough, landlords are actually saying the same thing now that their income has been pulled off. They're saying, well, I can't go 2, 3, 4 months. The whole system is perpetuated around the fact that it can continue ad infinitum forever. And any little bump in the road can cause it to collapse, especially now that we're learning, hey, you know what? All wealth does come from labor. Who would have fucking guessed that?
Oh yeah, it's hilarious. Honestly, I mean, that's what I find hilarious.
When the labor stops and the wealth stops being generated, all of a sudden there's a panic, because it doesn't matter how many derivatives you have. Eventually, the core of the wealth has to come from somebody's work, even if it's derived 8 times out through weird stock shifts or whatever. At some point, it all comes down to the physical work and the physical extraction to create wealth or to create value in society. And if you don't have workers doing that, you don't have wealth being generated. And everything comes to a halt eventually. And that's what we're seeing.
No, absolutely. And, this is the thing. People deny time and time again. I mean, even the neoliberal economists claimed this. They said that Marx's labor theory of value was wrong, that it was erroneous nonsense, that it didn't take into account a lot of other different aspects of an economy. And yet here we are. The economy is shitting itself, quite literally, shitting its pants, because people aren't going to work. Imagine that. But that's the funny thing. And that's why they want to keep people working, because they know that if people stop working, their shareholders are going to lose money. And when their shareholders lose money, well, they get upset. And that it's just funny that the only way that they can maintain this is through the use of state sanctioned violence. That is through the use of violence. I mean, there's nothing else to it. It is just violence. I mean, because they can't come into work because they are ill with a serious condition, you are still committing an act of violence, because at the end of the day, you are limiting their ability to make a choice. That is violence. The point of the matter is violence is entrenched within the system, and that is why people who suggest that it isn't a violent system, that it is a system based upon free choice and liberty and democracy, when that's not the case. It couldn't be more authoritarian if it tried. In fact, it's laughably authoritarian. It's not even trying to hide itself. And that's why people need to understand that it was always this authoritarian. It's only starting to rear its head out in the middle of a global crisis, And we're seeing that as well with the Earn It bill, which has been a recent thing as well. And I'm sure that you'd like to talk about that in detail as well, which is quite an interesting thing.
The Earn It bill, this was submitted by Lindsey Graham, and it's a bill that breaks the internet and effectively makes end-to-end encryption illegal without ever actually mentioning the word encryption. And the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has a few great articles on that. And I do recommend, for any digital advocacy, the EFF is a great group when it comes to this kind of stuff. They're always on top of things. So I actually recommend checking their stuff out on the regular, because they always post interesting stuff like this. But the Earn It bill, like I said, what it effectively does, it breaks the idea of encryption. So it didn't even have to mention it. And that's how sneaky this bill is. Really, I actually have to wonder if this is in part because A lot of the people that write down and legislate bills don't understand how the internet works, doesn't understand how information is transferred, doesn't understand the technical details. But also, I have to wonder if some of this was also legally constructed to do exactly what it does. It's hard to really tell at this point. Effectively, what it does to get rid of encryption is to say that websites have to implement some sort of content scanning system within their system to look for child pornography and to look for other illegal activity. And there's a huge problem with this in the fact that you can't have end to end encryption and an active scanning component as well. And one of the things that's heavily suggested in the bill is that the government provides this scanning system to websites. So this will be a service that websites could implement. So effectively, it's a man in the middle kind of NSA Prism style system that acts as a shim in between when your stuff gets submitted and when it gets encrypted. So it's no longer encrypted from the storage source on your device to the storage source on the other person's device, which is how end to end encryption actually works. We're not talking about transport encryption, which is SSL over the website, which this bill also breaks. And by breaking SSL, breaks pretty much all of e-commerce, breaks your bank website, breaks Google, breaks pretty much any search engine out there, pretty much any website out there, it breaks. And the reason is because you can't have an encrypted layer like that plus a scanning system of this nature. They are incompatible with each other.
I think that's pretty terrifying in a way, because again, it highlights how the crisis has almost been used as a mechanism to also allow the capitalist state to strengthen its hold over people where possible. And, I'm going to be honest, if you're a libertarian, the fake kind, you're probably not listening to this show. But if you are, you should oppose this bill. It's a bit terrifying because, again, these people clearly don't know how the internet works. I'm not much of a network analyst myself. I'm really not. I don't really have a clue, in fact. Even with the way it's written, you can just tell that it just seems to be used more as a tool of control rather than as something that's designed to actually help people.
On top of that, the other part of this is that it clearly shows that the people regulating the internet and that are elected to do so have no understanding of how the internet works, even though they're charged with that regulation. So they can pass regulations that break the internet, and everybody suffers from it. But also, one thing that is important to mention, and it's something that Chris Fisher at Jupiter Broadcasting on TechSnap a long time ago talked about when he was talking about a similar bill that they were trying to put through a couple years back. And he said something that pretty much sums up the entire situation. And that is, you cannot have security without privacy, and you cannot have privacy without security. That these two things are integrated. And if you remove privacy from the internet, you will inherently remove security features from the internet. This is not something that is a sliding scale that like you could take from or whatever. These same technologies that implement security also implement privacy and vice versa, because that's what they're designed to do. That's how it goes about it, and you can't do it any other way.
Yes, and that's the thing, though. It's kind of the overarching theme of the whole episode as well. It's control. The state and corporations, for that matter, they want to maintain that control in a way, whether with regards to corporations, whether it's maintaining corporate image by donating small amounts of money, a pittance of their profits, essentially, to quote unquote cure efforts for the coronavirus, whether it's getting their companies to develop, life-saving equipment to sell for a profit on the market, or whether it is, as we've demonstrated here, the state trying to essentially attack internet free speech and security. We can tell here that the virus is being used almost as a mechanism for a tool of control, and this is the problem. And what leftists need to understand is that we need to oppose that. We need to point it out, and we need to make it clear what these kind of bills actually mean, what corporations actually mean when they say that they're trying to serve the people in whatever way they can, even though they don't really. We need to look through the lies, through the fakeness of the whole ordeal, to look at what it actually implies. Because at the end of the day, they don't care about us. At the end of the day, we're just tools to them.
And I do think that there is no better example of not just the Earn It bill, but also the emergency declaration in Hungary as well, which expanded the powers of, I believe his name is Orban, the prime minister there, who signed a
Dictator,
declaration of
you mean?
emergency, yes. And right immediately after this declaration of emergency, under his expanded powers, the first thing that he pretty much did was go after the LGBTQ community. That's literally the first thing he does within days of signing this. So it wasn't even about the virus. It wasn't about the pandemic. It wasn't about saving lives. It was about buckling down on what he viewed as social problems through oppressing other people, going after LGBT, saying that, oh, you know what, because of health reasons, we're not going to let you change your birth certificate and whatnot. And eventually, we're going to see them start clamping down. We're seeing a lot of disturbing developments come out of Hungary through power grabs like this. And this isn't the first time the prime minister of Hungary has done something like this, and it certainly won't be the last. So it is definitely something that we need to keep an eye on because it is developing very fast there, just like it is in the United States, just like it is around the world right now, where we are seeing excuses being raised to clamp down on people, to get people to shut up, to corner certain groups of people. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, basically, yes. That's the whole idea of it. And that's why, to me, this is why individualism fails at addressing the problem of the whole ordeal. Now, people are probably thinking, oh, you just flip flopped individualism here because you don't like individualism. No, it's because, primarily speaking, the entire reason why people can't take action on this, or why people feel so powerless, is because they feel like they're just one person in a wider open world, and that they can't change the whole thing. They should only worry in turn then about themselves. But the truth is, where militancy is required, the only choice is to have a collective that is aware of the problem.
Right. And it's kind of funny because the government absolutely knows this. That's where they derive their power from a lot of times is collective action. Corporations know this. And in fact, they use this in a way. Corporations are always about teamwork, if you will, even if they do like to pit their workers against each other, at the end of the day, they know that their workers have to orient towards some sort of goal if they want to get anything done. It's just how they implement things is that while on the surface, they do want people to be atomized, they do want to give people a sense of individualism, but at the same time, they use this, they know and understand the power that people have in aggregate, and they do use it. That's a lot of times what you see when you're looking at a lot of propaganda, be it from the government, being it from conservative news sources, being from conservative sources on social media, what have you. A lot of times there is, in a way, selective certain calls to action, but they're very limited in scope and they're designed to make you think that you're acting independently, that it's giving you a false sense or a false consciousness of individuality as well. Whereas under socialism, even though we have this idea that we all come together at the end of the day, the truth of the matter is that in terms of things like individual liberty, socialists and leftists, for the most part, don't care about whether or not somebody is gay, whether or not somebody is trans, whether or not somebody is a certain race, because at the end of the day, we all have to work together to benefit each other, benefit our community, and get what we need. Whereas corporations And capitalism in general, as a whole, operates on getting all these groups that compete with one another to argue amongst themselves so that the powers that are in charge can just remain as established powers to maintain the status quo. And that really has become obvious within the last few months, in my opinion, that the nature of capitalism has been laid bare for everybody to see. And now we're seeing the response to that is we're seeing a mass rejection almost, if you will, of this because people are smart and they understand exactly what is happening now. And on a scale that we haven't seen in 50, 70 years or so in the United States, really, since the McCarthy era.
Oh, definitely. And that's why, I still find it funny that conservatives will still shout until the cows come home, basically, that socialism is dead, because of kicking us in the balls with regards to electoralism, because they don't want us to actually have progressive candidates in electoral politics. And that's the thing, they will continue to tell us that. But the fact of the matter is, it isn't. Because if it was dead, people wouldn't be taking action to actually do something about the problems within our society. That's the whole idea. People are coming together, people are trying to do something about it, and we're seeing that with the rent strike right now. And I highly encourage people who are interested in getting involved, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, to check out the entire principles of the rent strike this year. It's you can visit their website at www.rentstrike2020.org, and there's plenty of other resources there. I mean, there's one thing I will say is, if you are getting involved in the rent strike, you also need to be very cautious.
Yeah, you need to make sure if you're getting involved in the rent strike to not go it alone. That's one of the reasons why, even though I support the rent strike, I am not participating in it because I live in a corporate owned building that's mostly student housing. Unfortunately, a lot of people have actually left because of it being student housing and because of the situation. And also, it's kind of hard for everybody to communicate because of how our building's designed. Our building's literally designed to keep people from communicating. Even like when you go up on the floors, like each floor has like a card pass that you have to swipe to get in. It's one of those situations where it's hard for people to get organized physically on top of all that. So it's always important that if you're going to participate in a rent strike, that you know where your neighbors stand, because it's going to be your neighbors that you rely on. It's going to be your neighbors that come and help you in the event that, a private company shows up or police show up and try to evict you. And we saw a lot of that like in our history in the United States, like during the Great Depression. There were groups of people that would spontaneously form, well, not really spontaneously, but they were organized. And if somebody were evicted, they would literally just show up at somebody's property, oftentimes armed, and run the sheriff or run the evictors off the property. We're not there when it comes to that kind of organization right now in a lot of places, and we really need to be. We need to be in a place where people can defend the property that they live on, help defend other people. But also, if you're going to participate in a rent strike, you first need to get the basics down before you even get to that level, because more than likely, we're probably not going to get to that level anytime soon. It takes years to get to that kind of place. Right now, you need to find out who is on board, who is yes, who's no, who's maybe. If it's maybe, what is it that they need to get on board with this? What can you do to help them or convince them? Otherwise, come to your side of the fence. And once you got that figured out, once you find out if it's a need that they have, if it's a worry they have, if it's something that you provide a solution for them, then they will help you out and they'll join in, more than likely. But unless you are organizing properly, unless you're going through that process of contacting your neighbors, organizing, meeting up with them, discussing stuff, and make sure if you do meet up, of course, social distancing, always important. You can meet up in a park, stand out 6 feet apart from each other, and have a discussion. Like you don't have to like huddle around and whisper and get up into each other's faces. Please don't do that. Make sure that you're doing things properly. Keep in mind that for the sake of other people's safety, for the sake of families, etc., that you're not going to accidentally spread the virus to somebody.
A second overarching theme, or the second main overarching theme throughout the show, barring control or governmental control combined with corporate control, has been culture. And again, you could argue that we've spent a lot of time taking a shit on individualism within the show, but the whole reason why a lot of us criticize the concept of individualism is primarily because, well, this is the result of it. If it's not the panic buying, it's everything else that's been occurring as a result of it. It's a sociological phenomenon, and that's the point. To acknowledge that that exists the way it is, or the way it has. That's why it's became such a big problem. I think a final thing to kind of touch on in that regard, and it might seem like something quite inconsequential, but the truth is it really isn't. It's not just to do with the culture we witness in our everyday lives, but it's also a lot of it's an internet culture as well. And this kind of culture leads to a problem of sexism, I'd argue, as we've probably seen quite a bit over the past while. And I'm sure you could elaborate on that.
I would argue that it's more than just a internet culture thing. But Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor, if you will, of the internet, along with Vint Cerf, came out with a announcement the other day saying that the internet doesn't really work for women. It doesn't work for LGBTQ people. It doesn't work for people of color. It just isn't working for effectively people that lack certain privileges within our society, that certain groups of people are being chased off of the internet effectively because of mass bullying, because of massive campaigns to go after women, trans people, gay people, African Americans, people of color, what have you. And we see it every day online. If you go to Twitter, it's rampant. It's abundant on every social network, Twitter, Facebook, all the social networks. And they very clearly refuse to deal with the problem. And it's so funny because I saw this article, and when I saw this article, it was at a time that you were dealing with a specific problem in regards to fur affinity, I believe, FA.
Fur affinity has had problems as well over the past while. In fact, I've myself and quite a large proportion of people that I am familiar with have been checking FA essentially to witness what I can only describe, if you will, as a surge in fascist fan art.
Literal fascist fan art too, not like the interpretation of it being fascist. Like, we're talking about people that literally post like swastikas of black suns and stuff like that, and
Oh, Black Suns are
we're seeing,
favorite.
yeah, the black sun is always a favorite among them. I guess because they think it looks cool, but like it really just comes off as fucking edgy, is what it is. Like, just like everything else that they do, it comes off like being an edgy dweeb. But the problem is this kind of stuff runs people off because gay people, trans people, people of color, most people of any level of intelligence as well know what those symbols mean, and they know what they're alluding to. It's very obvious if you look at a lot of these people's posts, if you look at a lot of their art on there, if you look at what they're saying, they're not just making some ironic statement at this point. It's quite obvious that they are full on doing this for the idea of promoting these ideas, and also to create harassment campaigns against anybody that accuses them of doing what they are doing.
Yeah, and that's what grifters have done. It's plausible deniability.
It's plausible deniability and playing the victim as well. So they will always try to flip the script. They will always try to say that they are the victim while they are sicking their dogs on other people, while they're going after good people on the internet. A lot of times it's people that have done nothing. Maybe they made like a snide comment or a snide remark or a joke, or maybe they just said something, off the cuff as well. And all of a sudden you go in and you look at the replies to their statement. It's a bunch of fucking Pepe avatars. It's absolutely ridiculous. And like, a lot of people like to get on to me because I fucking hate Pepe, but honestly, one, it's an ugly looking meme. It's objectively bad art. I hate to say like objectively bad art, but like it's objectively bad art. It's not fun to look at. I don't get people's obsession with it. I don't get people's obsession with Wojak or any of that kind of stuff. I don't want to say it's because I'm old school. I just think honestly I'm just tired of seeing it every day. It's exhausting, and it's exhausting when it's an obvious dog whistle used by thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people or millions of sock puppets on the internet to harass people, and people make it like it's nothing. Like, oh, they're just joking. They're being ironic. But they're not joking. They're not being ironic. And it's driving people away from the internet. It's compound bullying. Like Tim Berners-Lee said, it's a problem that websites refuse to deal with. And it's one that we have to come to terms with if we're going to have an internet that works for everybody, that everybody can use. That you have to have these rules in place. You have to have rules to respect one another. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody gets along, because that's never going to happen. That doesn't even happen in pure leftist spaces. God knows it doesn't, much less, when you throw everybody else in. But you can't have people out there just openly calling for genocide. You can't have people sitting there with swastika posting about gas chambers and posting about, the whole, like 12% of the people commit 50% of crime. You can't have that because, one, it's spreading lies, but two, it's creating hatred. It is creating fascism, and it is running people off.
Yeah, and again, that goes back to my, original suggestion for a strategy. And the problem was, it's that a lot of leftists seem to think that if you take the problem seriously and tell these people why they're wrong, that it will somehow work out. But that's not the case. They don't listen, because if they did
Right.
listen, they would change. That's why I think one of the most powerful tools the left can use, at least on the internet, for those that are in a purely internet space, it's mockery. Be a sarcastic prick, because the truth is they hate it. They absolutely hate it.
They hate the idea that we could be humorous as well. That's one of the big things about the left that they try to accuse us of, is not having humor, of not being funny. And then when we are humorous, when we are funny, they flip the script and they try to turn it into they're bullying me and I'm the victim. And they do it consistently every time. The easiest way to make these people butthurt is to not take them seriously, to joke about them, to essentially just lay into them in the most humiliating manner possible, to know that, no, you're not serious and we're not going to treat you with serious intent here. That, yeah, while, privately, of course, we would be that looking at this from a tactical perspective, but they fucking hate being mocked. And you're absolutely right, because they have an inferiority complex. That's what it is. They want to be always taken seriously. So when you don't take them seriously, they feel that that's an attack against them. So one of the other things that we can also do, in my opinion, in addition to laying on the humor, laying on the mockery of going at them from that angle, is that our websites are not working for us. Facebook, Twitter, none of those websites are working in our interest, or working in the interest of protecting its users, protecting its women online, protecting LGBTQ communities, protecting people of color online. None of them are actively doing things to protect vulnerable people online and keep them from being pushed off, to keep them from being silenced. And so what I think is very important, and what I think the takeaway to this is that we have the tools for us to actually do something. Now, while we don't have the same resources as Facebook or Twitter, it is trivial for somebody to go out there and, with a little bit of experience, with a little bit of reading, with a little bit of knowledge, and maybe a friend that is good at computers as well, to go out there, find a host, put up a Mastodon instance or some other prefab website that's federated, for instance, that's open source, that's kind of prepackaged, that you dump on there, you get it working, and you find somebody to help you maintain that if you can't. Or if you can't start the website, if you just don't have that kind of experience, and I definitely understand that, because computers are hard no matter what people say. Yeah, I've used Linux for 20 years. I love open source, but I'm not going to badger somebody because they can't figure out how to use a computer, because their choice of operating system is Windows 10, because that's all they've known for all their lives. Instead, I want to empower those people to maybe in the future use open source software, but I'm not going to badger somebody to do it. And I'm also not going to insult their intelligence either. I'm going to understand that, hey, we all grew up with different things, and there's reasons behind people's preferences. When we're looking at this kind of stuff, we need to look at what's available, what we can build, and what we can get other people to use. And I think that sites like Mastodon, sites like Pixiv in place of Instagram, like Nerdica in place of Nerdica is in place of Facebook, which is, I'm sorry, Friendica in place of Facebook, I'm sorry, and Diaspora in place of Google Plus, which, rest in peace, died last year.
Thank God.
Wasn't that bad. It actually had a pretty good leftist community on there, pretty strong. But unfortunately, it was Google. And let's be real, Google has a way of changing things on a dime that could infuriate you. Let's just say that.
Apart from things being done by bots, yeah.
It really depended on the community. If your community was well moderated, you didn't have to deal with bots. But that was a big problem on the general Google Plus community, is so much of it was bots. After a time, the real magic just kind of happened in these little communities where that were properly moderated. And that's the key here, really, to what Tim Berners-Lee is saying here, is that these websites, honestly, they're just not moderating properly. They refuse to moderate. They want to give bad actors who whine about free speech while wanting to shove people in gas chambers the benefit of the doubt. Well, they want people to argue this in the free marketplace of ideas, while these same people are going out there and shooting up churches, going out there shooting up schools and malls and all sorts of things. And it's very clear where this stuff originates and where it breeds. And we have a chance to moderate it, to cut it off, to track this stuff before it's a danger to people. And we've chosen not to. Instead, we've chosen to give the benefit of the doubt, like I said, and create a hostile internet for anybody that's not a straight white male, pretty much. For anybody that doesn't kowtow the line there. That is one of the big issues of our day, is how do we deal with this, because it affects every other portion of society. And so I really do think the solution is going out there and building these federated sites that allow us, the people, to decide who we're going to communicate with, what networks we're going to federate with, and also what features eventually, because this is all open source, that get implemented in these websites. Not just the moderation, but also, are these sites accidentally by design doing this through algorithms, for instance? And that's what we're seeing a lot of times, is that these algorithms are picking this shit up and rolling with it. If you go on YouTube and you watch a few gaming videos on a clean profile, it doesn't take long to get the PewDiePie. And once you get the PewDiePie,
It goes downhill from there.
it doesn't take that long for all sorts of right-wing crap to pop up in your recommendations, because these people understand the algorithm, have gamed the system in a manner that is quite frankly impressive. And it shows how they have weaponized these algorithms to do exactly what they want, to spread their propaganda.
Yep.
And so it is very clear that Tim Berners-Lee is exactly right, that the internet is broken. For a large sum of the internet, for over 50% of the population, women, that's about 50, anywhere from 49 to 52% of the population in any given place, except for maybe like China. So it's mind-boggling that we have an internet that doesn't work for half of the people, that for half of the people, there is a risk of just being totally chased offline, to be harassed no matter what network. These people will follow you to the ends of the fucking earth if you piss some of these people off. And that's what we're dealing with. If corporations don't step up, we have to build it. And that's how it always is. And the good news is that unlike a lot of other industries, this is not something that takes a ton of capital. This is something that takes a website, word of mouth, and getting people to commit to going to these websites and using them on a regular basis, which may be a challenge, but it's certainly less hard than bootstrapping a lot of other industries.
Oh, definitely.
And if we don't try, and if we don't do it, there's a huge cost. That's why I'm really big, and why, towards the end of every episode, I do advocate this. I say, one, go out there and unionize your work, and two, go join Snouts Online if you're a furry, or another Mastodon instance if you're not. And the cool thing about Mastodon, by the way, a lot of it's very interest-based, so you join based off of kind of your interests within a community. But it's like email. So the people on your local server might all have similar interests, but you can see posts from friends on other servers. So think of it like Twitter, but email, kinda. Like, you got multiple servers out there, they're all kind of talking to each other. But when you log on, it kind of just looks like Twitter. Kind of works like Twitter too. And it's fairly easy to use once you get into it. And I highly recommend that people go out there and use it. Is it for everybody? Maybe not. But if you use Twitter, I highly recommend getting that Mastodon account, getting accustomed to it, understanding how this stuff works, because this is how we build the internet of the future. This is how we build an internet that works for everybody, that you don't have internet websites like Twitter that are just ran by blue checkmark accounts, bad actors, and their sock puppets. And so to close tonight, I will say, if you do want to get started with Mastodon, of course, you can follow us on Mastodon. I'm on snouts.online, which for most Mastodon accounts should be visible. And my username is kitsuneflame at snouts.online.
I am Dark Dewuski at Snouts.online.
Awesome. And of course, we both have Twitter accounts as well. So if you do want to go to the Hell site, you can look us both up. And our main Enceladus account is also on Twitter. So you could find us there, interact with us if you have questions, comments, any news you like to share. We always are sharing the headlines of the day there. Come join in the discussion. Also, I'm going to be opening up our studio Discord room. I'm gonna I already have a lobby in there, so if you want to communicate with us, if you want to participate in a discussion, or if you want to come talk to us, hang out in our lobby room, that would be great. Just let us know, and we'll get an invite out to you if you want to do that. As always, I want to thank you, Dark, here for joining us during the show, being such a great co-host. I absolutely enjoy your company. You have been...
Why?
Your company has been good the last few days, and I very much enjoyed speaking with you. I've kind of missed the past couple weeks of not being able to get in touch with you, and I know that you've been kind of busy as well.
Pandemics, they take up a lot of time.
Yeah, they do. They take up a lot of time, a lot of energy, and so I do want our listeners to know, I understand that things are difficult right now. But if we work together, work with our communities, we'll all get through this, hopefully. And I say hopefully because...
Definitely by the end of the year. But
yes.
You can't rely on governments to change that. Only you can rely on the collective to change that. And that's the important lesson.
Through working with our communities, through working with each other, we'll all get through this. We'll all get through this together. And it is through our solidarity that we get things done. And so with that solidarity, good night and good luck.
Solidarity.